Aloha, and welcome to Ehana Kako, a weekly program on the Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network. I'm Akina, president of the Grassroot Institute, and if you're watching from somewhere else on the planet other than Hawaii, I say aloha to you. We are here in the beautiful Pacific Plaza, downtown Honolulu, and we hope you will come and build our economy, and we'll come to wherever you are and build your economy. This is an opportunity for us to talk with movers and shakers about issues that are important both to Hawaii and to the entire planet. Today I have two wonderful guests with me. They happen to be the founders of the Zhou Enlai Peace Institute, and their business is all about creating global peace. I'm with Michael North as well as Xiao Fang Zhou. You're going to get to know them with me because they have wonderful things to say about peace, about business, about Hawaii, about China, about the world. And without further ado, let me say aloha to them both. And both of you are residents here in Hawaii. Michael, delighted you're with us today.
Good to see you, Kali'i.
And Xiao Fang.
Aloha, Dr. Akina.
Aloha to you. Michael, by the way, you have a tremendous high-tech background. Some of your early work before you founded Zhou Enlai Peace Institute had to do with something that has become very familiar to us, touch screens. You know, the funny thing, the kids today are using these iPads so much. You have these little 2-year-old children walking up to televisions, touching them, thinking that they should be caught up with the technology. But anything else about your background you may want to share that has brought you here to Hawaii and brought you to the founding of the Zhou Enlai Peace Institute?
Well, touchscreens brought me to Hawaii.
Is that right?
Yes. There was a time when a computer was just a blinking green cursor on a black screen.
I used to play Pong in those days.
And you had to type in a command and something happened.
That's right.
There was no icons, there was no clicking, there was no graphics, there was no animation, there was no video. And around about 1981, I thought, you know, this is going to change. It's got to be pictures that you touch. It's got to be sound that you hear to motivate people to communicate. And I thought at the time that it was the way that people who didn't have any computer skills could interact with computers. So I developed a company called North Communications, and we launched some of the first touchscreen
There you have it.
And one of the first clients that we developed with IBM was the public sector, state and local governments.
There you go.
And one of the first state and local governments to pick up on this opportunity was Governor Waihee, newly inaugurated as governor here in Hawaii in 1988. So we built a touchscreen network called Hawaii Access. And I started to come here, of course, as the head of the company, I could insist on being the account executive for Hawaii. And living in New York at the time, it was a bit of a hike, but I started to come here regularly, and I decided very early on that if I ever found an opportunity to both work and live here, then I would.
Well, Michael, I admire what you do because it comes from the technological world, but not only is it high tech, it's also high touch. Because your career,
you know, we were communicating with the Ilocano community, with the Samoan community, with the Hawaiian community. We did a quadrilingual program, English, Hawaiian, Ilocano, and Samoan, with leading local people on the screen, and we put the touchscreens out in libraries, community centers, housing developments, medical centers, and so on, where they could go and look for a job.
Well, how appropriate in Hawaii, and how appropriate now that your work has gone well beyond that to the issue of global peace. Now I'm going to turn to the guest here who is far more attractive than you and I. that is Xiao Fang Zhou. Xiao Fang, and by the way, I want to say this to our viewers today, Xiao Fang and Michael are continually celebrating their wedding and their marriage and their business partners as well as husband and wife, so that's delightful to see. Xiao Fang, you were involved in a lot of East-West business. You were involved representing Hawaii to China, vice versa, and so forth, with your bilingual background and so forth. And eventually, you founded Zhou Enlai Peace Institute. I know there's a personal family connection there. We want to tell our viewers what your connection is to Premier Zhou Enlai.
Yes. Well, Zhou family is, I actually started to learn the family of Zhou maybe 6, 7 years ago. And I didn't know, I was in one of the family Zhou reunion in Zhejiang, Jiujiang city.
Yes.
And that was actually first time, and there were a couple of thousands of people. They're all Joes. And I learned that there's 6 million Joes around the world. Aloha, all Joes.
There you go.
Yeah, so, and that's actually starting to learn the roots of
Yes.
where I come from since I've been
That's right.
Hawaii 22 years ago. And you know, Zhou Enlai is our ancestor.
In fact, you know, Zhou Enlai, as you and I were talking about once when we first met in the APEC convention here in Hawaii in 2011, your organization did an event during that time as well. Zhou Enlai is a very famous, what we call Neo-Confucian scholar.
Yes.
And he was a philosopher who carried on modernizing back then, near the 10th century, the tradition of Confucius. And what's interesting is that his heir, who became the premier of China, Zhou, is related to you. In what way?
Well, Zhou Enlai's grandfather has 5 brothers.
Okay.
And we are from the number 2. So he is my 7th great granduncle.
That's incredible. You know, when you go to China, and Michael, I'm sure you've picked this up there too, who you're related to before you got here is more important than who you are and where you're going. And so this is an incredible pedigree. What I'm interested in is how you two, and we'll talk about it later on, are using that pedigree to help advance one of your greatest concerns. But let me throw this question out to you. What do you think here on Earth is the greatest problem we're facing today? Michael?
It's peace between nations.
Or the lack of peace, right?
Yeah, it's the, well, I like to always state things to the positive.
Absolutely.
Okay?
Let's do
So, asserting peace, protecting peace, advancing peace, creating a climate of peace, a lifestyle of peace. That's got to be our number 1 priority, our number 1 overarching priority. Whatever our social philosophy is, whatever our political stance is, wherever we stand in the economic class and so on, peace is essential for everyone.
That's right.
From the most poor beggar in Mumbai to the richest billionaire in Manhattan, peace is the most important thing.
Yeah.
And for those of us in the middle, it's our job to find ways to assert peace, both within our own hearts, within our families, within our community, within our state and nation. And you know, as I got to know Xiao Fang and got to know her great uncle through her relatives and through many people in China, I realized that Zhou Enlai was one of the premier practitioners of practical peace of the 20th century. He showed courage, he showed vision, he showed leadership, he showed the ability to sacrifice without damaging himself, without throwing himself on the fire, but to put himself forward of the same caliber, the same vision as people who are much better known on the world stage, people like Nelson Mandela,
yes,
who just left us. Now, Mandela in Africa had vastly different background and challenges and environment and so on than Zhou Enlai in his decades in China. But there's a common spirit with him and Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi. They all shared a common declaration that peace begins with you.
Now what's interesting is that some of these names, most importantly Zhou Enlai, are not known outside of China or Asia, as well as names like Richard Nixon, who went to meet with Zhou Enlai in China. So in some sense, you're educating the rest of the world that there are people outside of the West who have done remarkable things for peace. But of course, Zhou Enlai, Premier of China, and I want to ask Xiao Fang this first. We've got China working toward peace. We've got the United States working toward peace, presumably. How important is peace between China and the U.S. to peace on this planet?
It is very important. China is a big country and America is a big country. And in 2010, China was in the global news.
Yes.
It surpassed Japan economically, become the second economic country in the world.
That's right.
And we are shoulder by shoulder. So the important is the collaboration and with understanding. And by that, you need to learn from the people who respect. To truly understand the Chinese, you need to understand what Chinese, you want to see view from Chinese eye, not as a Western eye, and to better understand Chinese.
As you talk about this, the collaboration, the importance of Chinese seeing through Western eyes, Western seeing through Chinese eyes, I can't help but think, looking at both of you, Xiao Fang and Michael, Xiao Fang from China, Michael from Vancouver, Canada, that we have a microcosm of the very thing you are trying to work toward across the world. Have you thought about that often?
Yes, after being living in the Western for over 20 years, and I really feel there's inseparable. We are nothing really much different. Of course, there's a differences. For instance, you like the sour, I like sweet.
That's right.
But for the heart, the common goal, and we all towards to peace, inner peace, and friend.
So, yes, there are differences, of course, like what our preferences are, deep cultural differences, ways of thinking, but we can major on what you're talking about, the commonness of the human heart. Now, Michael, you and I pretty much probably were reading the same news at the same time in high school and college and so forth. And there was a time when the relationship between China and the United States was vastly different, radically different. We had the Cold War, we had the Iron Curtain, we had Berlin Wall, we had all of this. So the best we could do was be at détente, some kind of distance from each other so that we didn't blow ourselves up, or mutually assured destruction, making sure that nobody pushed the button to launch nuclear weapons, because that would launch us into oblivion, and that's the thing that kept us safe. Yeah. But today, as Xiao Fang refers to it, there's collaboration. China looks at the United States as its biggest market. The United States looks to China for resources and so forth. Do you think that this kind of collaboration, in what way do you think this collaboration can lead to real practical peace in the world?
Well, you mentioned some historic events. History is a good way to understand where we are. And if you wind back before the Cold War, which is the first one that you mentioned, there's a very interesting aspect to the history between America and China that most people don't know, they don't focus on. There was a moment just before the independence of China when America and China were this close to being allies.
Well, that sounds intriguing.
We came really close.
What I'd like to do is ask you to pick up with that story as soon as I obey my producer, Jay Fidel, who's given me orders to take a very important break for a very important message. You're watching the Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network. We're delighted to have Michael North and Xiao Fang Zhou with us today, and I'm Keili'i Akina. Don't go away. We will be right back with Ehana Kako after this short message.
Aloha. I'm Nicole Hori for Think Tech. For nearly half a century, the Hawaii Foreign Trade Zone No. 9 has brought the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. DBET, the Department of Business, Economic Development and Tourism, operates Hawaii's Foreign Trade Zone program to encourage international business and economic development. The Foreign Trade Zone's mission is to increase the amount of international trading activity in Hawaii, thereby providing employment opportunities for the residents of our island state. For more information, see ftz9.org. I'm Nicole Hori. Mahalo.
Aloha again. Welcome back to Ehana Kako. We're a weekly program on the Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network. You can take a look at past programs with some outstanding individuals dealing with major global and Hawaii issues by simply going to the website of Think Tech Hawaii. That's thinktechhawaii.com. I'm Keili'i Akina with the Grassroots Institute, and pleased today to be talking about global peace with two individuals who've invested their lives in producing a more peaceful world. Michael North and Xiao Fang Zhou, who are the founders of the Zhou Enlai Peace Institute. And we're going to pick up with an intriguing statement that I think that Michael is going to make. Michael, we were talking about history. We were talking about the significance of the Cold War and understanding the relationship and direction of China and the U.S. today. But you're taking us back prior to that to something that's fairly important. Why don't you pick up?
I'll take you way back almost a century.
All right.
Ago. A young Zhou Enlai, well-educated, speaking several languages, traveling to major cities of the world, from Tokyo to Berlin to Paris and London, learning about the world and realizing that it was the American century was coming, and being fascinated with all things American. Forward 20 years or so, China is under attack by Japan, which is occupying big sections of the country and terrorizing the people. Who do the Chinese, under Zhou Enlai's leadership, go to ask for help? They go to Roosevelt, and they ask, can you send a few pilots to help us to fight the Japanese, because we only have little puddle jumpers, and can you send a few airplanes? So they started with 8, 12, 16, 20, ultimately several hundred, mainly at the first manned by volunteers, and these were the Flying Tigers of history. If anybody recognizes Flying Tigers, now you'll understand how powerful the alliance was between China and America at that time. The Americans were volunteering to come and fight and die in China, in Chinese airspace and on the ground for a long time during the revolution. While Zhou Enlai was building the revolution, Americans were helping him, and they were fascinated by the fact that the leaders of the independence movement in China, the unity movement in China, were the most disciplined, they were the most ordered, they were the most decent, they were the most sympathetic to the people. They embraced equality of opportunity, and they sent back reports saying, pay attention to these people. Now, they had the name communist, right? They were the Communist Party of China, and they were backed by the Soviet Union. This is what created the unfortunate historical dissonance, because America, for historic reasons which were very sound, was very properly suspicious of everything to do with the Soviet Union, therefore of communism, therefore of China, which had the Chinese Communist Party label. Something that most people don't know is that Zhou Enlai actually considered changing the name of the party.
That's fascinating.
At one point, because it was bad branding. And Zhou and Mao wrote a letter to Roosevelt in the days immediately after the end of World War II for us, proposing a broad-ranging alliance between China and America to develop the Pacific. Diplomats in the U.S. State Department, both in China and the United States, who were driven by the Red Scare paranoia, made sure that Roosevelt never saw that letter. So he never had an opportunity to respond to it. We came that close.
You know, that's really quite fascinating. In fact, I want to go back to the rest of your story, but let me just interject this, because it's incredible the way our own thinking kind of intertwines. Every year I lecture at a university in China called the People's University of China, Renmin Dashui, which happens to be the only major university that Mao Zedong allowed to be open during the Cultural Revolution. I've gotten to know the philosophy department, the largest division of which is Marxist philosophers. And what's really interesting is these scholars are trying to recover the Chinese understanding of communism, and they make a big difference between that and the Marxist-Leninist input. So that kind of...
Joe didn't like the Russians very much.
Well, he would be very happy.
They always spoke of socialism with a Chinese face. You know.
He would be very glad that today Chinese scholars are trying to go back to the kind of understanding of communism, bad name, of course, to use for branding, but the kind of understanding that is more authentically in keeping with the Chinese traditions and even the Confucian tradition. But let me let you go back to your story, because I think what you punctuated is important, that Zhou Enlai had a different understanding than the reigning Communist Party.
He was the only leader at the top tier of the party who had any international experience, who spoke any other language other than Chinese.
And that would be incredibly unusual at that time. Let me just ask Xiao Fang, wouldn't that be so unusual for someone who was so internationalized and spoke different foreign languages?
Yeah, during that time, it's you know, China has been when Zhou Enlai graduated, he was went to Japan, and during that time, China is under separate the people, and when he was in primary school, the teacher asked a student, "Why you study? What's your study for?" And all the students answer, "I study for my, you know, to serve my family, to make money." And Zhou Enlai's response is, "I study for China."
Wow, that's something. And well, Michael, I want to go back to the rest of the point that you're trying to make here, which actually includes the importance of Zhou Enlai's understanding for the world.
The point I'm trying to make is the leadership in China today owes its intellectual heritage to the work of Zhou Enlai. To a great extent, the excesses, the mistakes, the injustices of the Cultural Revolution have been disavowed by today's leadership.
Yes.
And this is something that most Americans don't know. They think that that's still being defended. No, it's been set aside, and the mistakes that Mao and many others made have been fully admitted, and they've been exposed, they've been documented, they've been publicized to everyone. Now, Zhou Enlai is the only one among that leadership whose reputation remains unstained, because he fought against all the excesses. So when you're looking to understand China today, if you're a businessman, if you want to attract real estate investment from China to Hawaii today, let's say, for example, it's important to understand what is the root of people's thinking, because they're not capital C communists. They're not against our way of life. They're not against America. There's so much that joins China and America, the Chinese way of doing and the American way of doing. The way of thinking, it may be very different. But what I've found is that Chinese are natural entrepreneurs.
Yes.
They love to take just 2 pieces of soap and rub them together, make more soap, and sell them for a penny more than they bought them, right? And Americans are natural entrepreneurs too.
Yes.
We're pioneers, right? Go west and create something new out of nothing. Chinese are that way too. They love to create something new out of nothing. They're focused on the benefit to their family, you know, intensely loyal, and they think long-term for the future. And in our best spirit of America, that's how we are too.
This is interesting, because who would have thought 50 years ago that perhaps the fastest growth of free market capitalism in the world would be in Chinese cities, whether it's Hong Kong, which had the Western influence, or some of the new centers of economic activities such as Shenzhen or Shanghai as a special economic zone. So I think you're very much on the money here.
Now I want to be careful here about something.
Yes.
Be very careful. We can admire economic success, but not for its own sake.
There you go.
We need to be critical of China. China should be critical of itself, and is beginning to be. Of course, we need to be critical of America. As a patriotic American, I never feel more strongly patriotic than when I'm able to point out something that America can do better in a constructive criticism. And so in the matter of human rights, in the matter of environment, in the matter of many other issues that we can see in the headlines today, we need to be properly skeptical of what China's leadership is doing. Now, they're aware of these issues just as aware as we are. And having met with some of them through family activities in China, I'm convinced that they are making a strong, good faith effort to solve these problems. They recognize the dangers of supranationalism, which are there in China as much as they are in any other great country. They recognize the dangers of militarism, of trying to make decisions through force or the threat of force, because they've seen America make all those mistakes, right? They're determined not to make the mistakes that we made, and yet they want to be responsible leaders for peace. And seeing that they've adopted Zhou Enlai as their philosophical guide. You know, I was at Nankai University a few weeks ago. I was invited to give a paper about Zhou Enlai and his business principles. Hearing the debate going on within the communist, Marxist scholars there from all around the country and around the world, and being part of it, I became convinced that they really have turned the corner from the kind of primitive philosophy that attended, that the peasants accorded to Mao Zedong. He was a lot more complex than they accorded him, than they recognized. But they've now turned the corner, and they become aware that China is at a place where they can be a leader of nations.
Sure.
And they want to be partners with America and with other countries to be leaders for peace, in the tradition that Zhou Enlai set.
You know, I think that there's a lot of rich meat to what you have just said, and both of you are participating in helping to give articulation to those values that China can use to be a positive force for peace in the world. One of the things, keeping in mind the balance that you maintain, which I respect tremendously, one of the things to keep in mind, of course, is it's very difficult to describe China. China is many things at once. And so while there are individuals whom you have met, whom I have met, who want to move forward with principles of peace, such as Zhou Enlai's own principles, China still has many forces at work that are trying to retain a more, I use the word conservative to talk about the past, a conservative control. And so what's interesting is that in this midst of different values emerging and competing for dominance in China, you two are offering something that comes from China's heritage, not from the West. Something that the Chinese could say, let's look back upon and let Chinese people use a figure such as Zhou Enlai and what he taught in order to convince other Chinese people of universal principles. But before we take a break, I want to ask Xiao Fang very quickly, in light of Michael's description of the relationship, the intimate relationship that is possible between the United States and China when we look at some common threads, isn't there a special relationship between China and Hawaii just as much, and in some ways maybe even closer? I'm not talking about your special relationship, but there is, isn't there? Hawaii and China is not just like Idaho and China.
Yeah. Hawaii and China has a long history. You raised two presidents in the world. One is China, is the Sun Yat-sen.
There you go.
You know, and he studied here in Punahou, and so that's
right.
Obama.
And also at Iolani as well.
Iolani,
that's
yes.
right.
So there's a long history built over 200 years ago.
Not to mention the large numbers of immigrants that came from China seeking that kind of free enterprise, the opportunity to do business that many did here on the plantations and built great businesses in Hawaii. Well, this is a fascinating conversation with two of my friends, Michael North and Xiao Fang Zhou, who are really at the front end of trying to articulate what Chinese values China can draw upon today in order to create a new future. And the delightful thing they've done is they've found a truly Chinese character, somebody who is respected by China, Zhou Enlai, and they are excellent interpreters of his teaching. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. This is Ehana Kako on Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network. Don't go away. We will be right back.
We want to thank our underwriters. Hawaiian Electric Company and its affiliates Maui Electric on Maui and Hawaii Electric Light Company on Hawaii Island are deeply committed to the communities they serve.
Galen Ho is a senior executive of BAE Systems, a global defense, security, and aerospace company.
The High-Tech Development Corporation, the state's leading technology agency, attached to the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism.
Castle and Cook Hawaii, with a time-honored legacy that spans more than 160 years and revolves around its mission of investing in Hawaii, creating communities, and providing for the needs of our state.
Hawaii Gas, formerly the Gas Company, a proponent of the Liquefied Natural Gas Initiative, helping Hawaii achieve its transition to clean energy and a better energy future.
Collateral Analytics, a Hawaii-based tech company empowering the real estate industry with greater and faster access to the tools and data they need to make better informed property investment decisions.
I'm Nicole Hori. Thanks so much for joining us on Think Tech.
I'm Maria Kashem. See you next time.
Aloha, welcome back again to E Hana Kako. E Hana Kako means let's work together. Many of you may be familiar with the saying E Pule Kako, a very sacred phrase here in Hawaii. E Hana Kako, well, E Pule Kako means let's pray together. E Hana Kako means let's work together. And that's what we believe in at the Grassroots Institute. We believe in uniting Hawaii's people for a better economy, government, and society. And we can do this respecting various political parties, religions, and different groups and ethnic groups, but we do it from the point of view that we can work together regardless of our background. And my guests today demonstrate that tremendously. They are Michael North and Xiao Fang, who are crossing bridges between the West and China through a certain kind of teaching that brings about world peace by focusing on something said by one of the exemplars, Zhou Enlai. We've all heard of Nelson Mandela, we've heard of Mother Teresa, we've heard of the Dalai Lama, who have had greater play perhaps in Western media. But Michael and Xiao Fang are at the forefront in helping the world understand the importance of Premier Zhou Enlai. And so let's continue our conversation. Michael and Xiao Fang, this has really been fascinating. Now you've articulated the very fundamental values of Zhou Enlai for the Zhou Enlai Peace Institute by referring to 5 principles. Do you want to share with us what those 5 principles are?
Sure. And they're based in Confucian thought.
Okay.
Although they're extremely practical, and they're stated in very, very basic political terms, because what they're intended to solve at the beginning is a situation that Zhou Enlai found at the end of 1953, 60 years ago now. New Year's Eve, 1953, 60 years and just a few days ago, he sat down looking at a world at war and threats of war, disorder, imperialism, colonialism, nuclear annihilation, facing us in multiple places.
I don't know, Michael, if you are as old as I am, but
I was just born.
Remember those days when people hid under their desks at school in simulated nuclear raids?
That's the world that he was looking at. And the question that he asked himself was, is there anything that we can agree upon as nations? Given the existence of fascism and communism and socialism and capitalism and Christianity and Islam and rich and poor and so on, is there anything with all of those multiple intersecting chasms that divide us? Is there anything that we can agree on? Okay, so he thought, and he came up with what he thought were 5 things that we could agree on. The first one is mutual respect for our territorial integrity and sovereignty, that each nation should respect the sovereignty, the territorial integrity of all other nations. And we have identified that with the element of earth in Confucian, in traditional Chinese philosophy. The second principle is mutual non-aggression. We're not going to threaten each other, we're not going to attack each other. We're not going to use force and the threat of force to intimidate each other. And we identified that with the principle of metal, with the idea that the sword can be a sword that of aggression, but it can also be the sword of knowledge and insight. The third principle is mutual non-interference. Okay, now we're getting a little more subtle. We're not going to attack each other. We're going to respect each other's territory. Now what do? Well, we have to respect that we're different. That you as China, or you as Italy or Australia or the UK or Canada, United States, you have your historic background, you have your cultures, your language, your way of seeing and doing things. You need to be allowed to solve your problems in your own way, and so that we don't interfere with each other. That we identified with the element of water. Okay, sort of not dissolving differences, but flowing around differences. You know, finding the lowest ground of non-resistance. The fourth principle that Zhou Enlai identified is one of equality and mutual benefit. So now he's turning it around. The first three are mainly negative, okay? The fourth principle is turning around and saying, what can we do that's positive? We're going to regard each other as equal, no matter how powerful or how rich we are. The largest nation is equal to the smallest nation and has equal rights. And we should do what we can to help each other. When we ask for help, then we should reach out for help. You know, if America sees that Tanzania needs solar panels, and Tanzania says we could use some solar panels, then it's our duty to invest in each other through equality and mutual benefit. That we identified with the principle of wood. Like, this is what you build your home from, right? It's the basic element of wood. The final principle, based on the element of fire, is peaceful coexistence. Okay, Zhou Enlai coined that term, peaceful coexistence. And it's the most positive one, which says, we're going to find a way to manage our affairs in a peaceful way. We may not agree on everything. In fact, let's not agree on everything. It's not necessary for us to dissolve our differences. Our differences are important. And this is a very important part of Zhou Enlai's character, because he did have such a vastly diverse cultural and educational background. He didn't say we all have to be one and sit around a campfire, kumbaya, and dissolve our differences in a kind of faceless unity. He said our differences are important, and the element of fire, peaceful coexistence. So what he did with this was he solved one practical problem immediately, within about 4 months. He used these principles at the center of a treaty between China and India over Tibet, over the issue of Tibet. They had, I won't go into all the difficult issues that were involved in that treaty, but at the center were these 5 principles. And the 5 principles made that treaty work. And Zhou Enlai and Nehru signed that treaty, avoiding a war between China and India, which at that time was looming. Could have been very imagine how disastrous that would have been for everybody. And he took that forward to more meetings. Ultimately, more than 120 countries endorsed the 5 principles. Eventually the United Nations did, the United States accepted it, and it's part of the core of diplomatic relations of all multilateral institutions, including APEC. They've all adopted those 5 principles at the center. So I regard that piece of work that he did and its advocacy that he carried out over the subsequent decades, which includes the initiative to America through Kissinger and so on. It includes the famous handshake, which is probably the only image that most Americans have ever seen of Zhou Enlai.
That's right.
Is him shaking hands with Richard Nixon.
Well, this isn't.
It's all part of those 5 principles of peace.
You know, one of the things that strikes me as you articulate this, and you've shared this with me many times before, but one of the things that strikes me is that it is both universal and Chinese. It's universal in the sense that these principles are so minimal that they are things that any culture can affirm. And any culture that ultimately produces peace is going to affirm this way of living with your neighbors. But they're also very Chinese, which I think is so important today, because we're not saying this is the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, or this is the United States foreign policy. We are saying this is authentically Chinese. Not only Zhou Enlai, but every one of the principles, as I was just sorting through my mind, can be backed in Confucian teaching, or in Taoist teaching, or in Buddhist teaching, the great traditions of China, and eventually Christian teaching.
By the way, we're in the process right now of tying these together with the 5 principles of Aloha. ALOHA.
The universality of
Yeah,
it.
there's you know the law of the spirit of Aloha that was
Yes.
passed by the legislature some years ago.
And let me
there
just
are 5
comment to my
principles.
listeners, my viewers, just for one moment here, because we have viewers from across the world. Michael is referring to the fact that aloha is not just a greeting that we give to visitors who come to Hawaii, and I hope you do come. It also happens to be part of the law that our legislature passed that said we must treat each other in a certain way. Well, they can't force us to treat each other, but they say that this is the principle by which we live. Now back to Michael, you're pointing out that the 5 values here of Zhou Enlai are actually in line with the aloha spirit.
There's a congruence between them. Big surprise. I mean, these are fundamental human principles. If you're a human being living on this earth and you think about what is it that works, you're going to come up with some very similar conclusions. Whatever time of the day or history or culture or language you have, you're going to come up with some, not always the same, but some congruent principles.
Yes.
We're exploring that.
Well, let me play devil's advocate for a moment, because I have been involved in panels in which some of the other speakers on the panel came from the security world, came from the military world. And many of them have had a very focused interpretation of China, a realpolitik, as we call it, that everything that China does is posturing for the sake of power. And so that's their grid. I've tried to point out to them there are principles that China can refer to, but they're very negative about that. They're saying, no, China is all about power, that the idea of these ancient principles playing a role in foreign policy is panacea. It's pie in the sky. And again, I'm playing the devil's advocate. What do you say when you hear that kind of talk? To say, Michael, this is just so idealistic. World governments don't operate according to these wonderful principles. They operate according to power.
I say they have not taken the time to see the world through Chinese eyes. They're seeing China through European eyes, through American eyes. They're seeing China through Bismarck, through the eyes of Henry Kissinger. China is not America. China does, this is really important for anybody who deals with China.
Well,
China does not want to become America. They acknowledge our accomplishments. They admire many of the things, but their goal is not to become an Asian version of America. China is a culture that is 6,000 years deep. They're extremely proud of who they are, and we had better listen and learn to see through their eyes, because when we see us through their eyes, we'll understand ourselves better, and we can help China see America through American eyes. You know, if I could take a radical Chinese leader to a baseball game, to a Dodgers game, if I could send, you know, this morning Xiao Fang and I were looking at a photo album that just came out of the White House, which is the year-in pictures seen from the point of view of the Obama family, right? If I could show those 100 pictures to Chinese people, they would understand the warmth and reality, the depth of heart, the soul that is America.
On that point, we're going to take a break and come back and conclude this wonderful conversation and bring the images and the values together. I'm Keli'i Akina with the Grassroot Institute. You're watching E Hana Kākou. Before I go, I want to say thanks to Jay Fidel, producer-in-chief of the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. You can find more programs cataloged wonderfully at thinktechhawaii.com. We'll be right back for our final segment after this.
Aloha, I'm Jay Fidel for ThinkTech. For nearly half a century, the Hawaiian Foreign Trade Zone, number 9, has brought the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. DBED, the Hawaii Department of Business, Economic Development and Tourism, operates Hawaii's Foreign Trade Zone program. It does so to encourage international business and economic development. The Foreign Trade Zone mission is to increase the amount of international trading activity in Hawaii, thereby providing employment opportunities for the residents of our island state. For more information, see ftz9.org. I'm Jay Fidel of ThinkTech. Mahalo.
Aloha, this is Akina with the Grassroots Institute on the Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network. We've been dealing with a complex subject today, peace on Earth. How do we approach peace? There are those who say we need to have a very hard-nosed look at the pragmatism of China and realize that power is at play constantly. And there are others who are saying there are other resources available to us. Maybe it's not an either-or. Maybe it's both and in the midst of this, to whatever degree you accord credence to the idea that ideas matter, there are two wonderful entrepreneurs of ideas who are with us today. Michael North and Xiao Fang Zhou. They're taking the ideas of Zhou Enlai and circulating them in China and across the world in hopes of producing a world that is closer to maintaining peace. Michael has a story for us to close off our conversation a bit today, and you're a master at storytelling. Your whole organization, the Zhou Enlai Peace Institute, tells stories. In fact, it's telling a big story. Why don't you give our viewers in the next minute just a glimpse to the story? I know I catch you at a disadvantage to give you so little time, but let me invite you.
One story can sometimes say more than 1,000 words.
It sounds like
of
a Chinese
discussion
proverb.
And analysis. I'm sure it is. And there was a time when Zhou Enlai was on a stage in front of a chaotic audience, divided into two warring camps, screaming at each other. And next to Zhou Enlai, the premier of China, was a man who was being attacked by one of those factions, that he should be immediately arrested and thrown into the streets and taken away because he had betrayed the people. Zhou Enlai surveyed this chaos and knew that this was a moment when one single spark could spread through the whole country of China. He recognized the danger. So how did he respond? As a man of peace, he strode to the edge of the stage and stood in stillness, in silence, looking across the entire audience, not moving. And he stood. They began to pay attention. He turned his back and stood with his back to the chaos. And he kept standing, more silently, more deeply. The room finally settled and became still with him. And only then did he turn around and say, "All right, now let us move forward."
You know, Michael, there's a depth there to that story that does say more than words say. The man lived the message that he gave to the world. And I want to say thank you to you, Michael North.
Well, say thank you to Xiao Fang. I wouldn't be here.
Zhou Enlai.
I wouldn't have learned any of this. I was an ignorant American like most of us before I met her.
Yes,
and now
absolutely.
I've had an opportunity to lift the cover a little bit.
And thank you to you, Xiao Fang Zhou. You're carrying on in the tradition of your ancestor, which is a very important tradition to the Chinese. I'm glad both of you are here with us today, and you're doing good work at the Zhou Enlai Peace Institute. Thank you for being on Ehana Kako. I appreciate that. You've heard two fascinating people, and I encourage you to go to Google and look up Zhou Enlai Peace Institute, because you'll see a wealth of material as well as photographs of the great work that they're doing in China and across the world. Why is their perspective important? For those of you who are followers of the Grassroots Institute, you will find in the Zhou Enlai Peace Institute an articulation of some of the fundamental principles we have come to believe in, that the individual is important, that we need to empower the individual with freedom, autonomy, and liberty, that free markets, economics that allows businesses and individuals to compete with each other fairly is an important thing, and that limited accountable government, something that surprisingly has some roots in China as well, modern China. Keeping the government limited and accountable is an important value. But I don't think that we could express those values as eloquently as people like Zhou Enlai. And so I'm very grateful to Michael and to Xiao Fang for your work, and to all of you watching the Ehana Kako program. We'll be back again next week on the Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network. Much aloha to Jay Fidel and the team, and to all of you, I'm Akina with the Grassroots Institute. Aloha.